The electricity challenge that we're facing is very concerning to all of us, and it's quite complex, and we keeping that whole issue of electricity on our radar screen every hour, every minute, and looking at precisely what is happening, how the executives are handling it, how the board is handling it, and indeed how the Department of Public Enterprises and the Minister are handling it. And Samkelo would like me to say here and now that so-and-so is going to be fired, so-and-so is going to be fired. We don't work like that, Samkelo. It is a major, major problem affecting not only the individual lives of people, but the economy as well. And the load shedding, as we talk now, is also having other adverse effects, such as jobs and the performance of our economy. So it is the biggest risk, as we have said in the past, and we are in the process of looking very closely at how best all this should be done. We've got up to 16,000 megawatts out of commission, and whilst some 5,000 or so were being repaired. And then this was also exacerbated by the situation in Zambia, where the Cahora Bassa power supply or power generation was also affected. So it's a combination of a whole range of problems and challenges, which we are continuing to work on, to look at, and to continue to look at, yes, the proficiency and the capabilities of everyone who is involved, and seeking to find solutions for all this.
Well, for a little bit more on these rolling blackouts, these planned outages, we're now joined via Zoom by Dave Nicholls, who's the chairperson of the Nuclear Energy Corporation of South Africa, NECSA, but he also spent 33 years at Eskom, so he knows a thing or two about this power utility. Dave, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Welcome to the programme.
Thank you for inviting me.
All right, so I woke up on Monday morning to load shedding and messages that we'd gone to stage 4. It took me by surprise. Did it take you by surprise?
Clearly, the actual timing of when we get hit by which batch of load shedding is a function of particular machine failures. But in general, no, this, in my opinion, is a direct result of the policy put forward since 1998. Which drove us into this corner. And just by that context, everyone talks about demand electricity. We haven't a clue what demand in this country is. We know up until 2007, Eskom had spare machines, so we knew that if a customer wanted more power, we gave it to them. Since 2007, Eskom's never had a spare machine, and therefore since 2007, we've not been meeting demand, we've been constrained by supply.
All right.
And just to put it in context, yeah, sure. Back to you, sir.
Well, let's go back to 1998, because that's where you started. What were the decisions that we made that have put us where we are today in 2021?
Okay, there was a great belief in the industry widely, not just in South Africa, it's a worldwide industry, that the free market was a better way of running big companies like Eskom, the natural monopolies of this world, than having a state-regulated utility. And so in the mid-1990s, culminating in the energy policy of 98, it was decided that Eskom would essentially be broken up. That's not new. Eskom was going to get restructured into a generation, transmission, and distribution company. In fact, there will be several generation companies. The aim was to sell off about 70% of Eskom's generation capacity to the private sector. And the private sector would build future power stations. And the private sector would enter into contracts with customers, with the grid system acting as an intermediary, but not actually being the contracting party. That was the plan. Eskom said in 98 that our projections said we'd run out of power in 2007, which was spot on. And nobody came to the market. No one came. No free marketeer came in and said, "I'll build a plant." And there's very good reasons for that. The most obvious reason is that power generation is a very expensive, capital-intensive business. You're building something which may take you 5 or 8 years to build, and you're going to get the payback over the next 20 years, assuming the market is what you assume they're going to be. So the risks are very great. And so nobody came into the marketplace. And in 2004, Eskom was told, change all your policies, recreate the departments you closed down in 1998, which were the construction and the engineering companies, and start building plant because nobody else is building. That was Medupi, Kasili, and Ngula. And essentially Eskom was in the back foot from there.
So 2007, the power ran out on time, as predicted.
Yeah.
What could we have done then to prevent what we're seeing now, or had the horse already bolted?
Well, let me, if I may, give you three very high-level scenarios.
Yeah.
From 1982 to 2007, the peak demand, the demand in this country rose by compound rate of 3.4% a year, which was quite reasonable for a developing economy. So the first comment is, if in 98 we had decided to go forward and build more plants sensibly, we wouldn't have had the crisis of Medupi and Kasili, where there was no skill set to build it. It was built in a screaming hurry. We had to recreate organizations we had disbanded because we were told we weren't building anything. We would have gone on at 3.4% growth rate, which is what the rest of the developing countries have done. I'm not that exact number, but that's what our number was. And we'd now be at about 60,000 megawatts peak. Which means we'd have about 30 to 40% more GDP than we currently have, and jobs and so on. Okay, that was the idealized solution that we sought out the build program back in the mid-1990s. Assuming in 2007, we committed to a large build program, which was the plan, then we would now be getting out of the hole. And let me give you the plan that I was particularly involved with, was building the nuclear fleet at that time. And Eskom was sitting there having built Medupi and Kasili, called Coal 1 and Coal 2. And there was plans for Coal 3 and Coal 4. There was plans for Nuclear 1, Nuclear 2, Nuclear 3. If you think about power. And there was plans for more pump storage schemes. At the end of 2008, Eskom just basically realized that its balance sheet, as it was configured and as the tariff was being run, would not allow it to go on building plant. So Eskom at the end of 2008, essentially, cancelled all the projects for new build, except for Medupi, Kasili, and Ngula. So the Coal 3, the Coal 4, the stations that would have been built better because you learn as you do things, and so would have been okay. So that was the next crisis that essentially we never recovered from 2007. And in fact, the energy consumption stayed the same since then, which is not a growing economy. The challenge now, of course, is that the older stations are now running out of life. The new stations are going through a bathtub curve. Everyone says they're horribly unreliable, and yes, they are horribly unreliable. But that's standard for new power stations. Maybe Medupi, Kasili are worse than most. But my assumption is there'll be no different to Kendal or something, which when it first started up was horrendous. And then it settled down after a couple of years. And you can see that now. Medupi is more reliable than Kasili. Look at the numbers, about twice as reliable as Kasili. And so as those come in, we're taking old stations out. In about 2028, we're going to find a situation where we're shutting down stations that can't be run anymore because, as everyone says, they've been run into the ground certainly for the last 15 years. They've been run whenever you can run. And we'll then have a situation of, not as we've had since 2007, where we're telling people, you cannot build a new energy-consuming plant in this country because there's no power for it. That stopped growth. If we don't do something reasonably dramatic, by about 2030, we'll be telling companies that are currently running that there's no more Eskom power for. Not just that there's no more power occasionally, but that there's no more power, we're going to turn you off. And that's the biggest challenge at the moment.
All right, so we're in 2021. You were the chief nuclear officer. Do we race to build nuclear plants alongside renewables? What do you think is the quickest route, even though it's longish term, to fix the country's energy crisis for a good number of years going ahead?
Well, let's start with the renewable discussion, because here I'm going to be a little bit of a I happened to pull up, when you told me I was coming on tonight, I pulled up the grid connection, the renewable energy production, Eskom's announcement of what renewable energy produced over the month of May. I happen to have those numbers on my PC. Yeah. And what's interesting is that of something like 6,500 megawatts of installed renewable energy on the system, we hit a peak of production on about the 6th of June of about 3,750 megawatts. But we hit a low of around 278 megawatts on another day. So the first trouble is, if you're going to support an industrial grid, and this is true across the world, everybody's found this, the renewables need to get essentially 100% backed up by something that is dispatchable. In other words, and it could be batteries, but batteries are horrendously expensive and very small compared to grid requirements. And most of the cost of batteries is the cost of materials, so that's not going to come down that much more. So my answer, if I was asked now to do I'd say we need to get something urgently in, very much in line with the risk mitigation IPP program, which was a program driven by technology neutral, performance driven. I need power for this much over this time. What can you do for me? That, of course, has been hung up with the whole power ship discussion, because nobody wanted the Turkish power ships to win. It was meant to be won by the renewable lobbies. So I would push ahead with those while pushing ahead with the nuclear build program. What's interesting is that if you look at in the world as a whole, internationally, the rate at which people have put new technology into the field, certainly low carbon technology, has been dominated by examples where nuclear has been doing, like Sweden, France, elsewhere, much more energy. So my answer at the moment is that we should be pushing hard for more of the risk mitigation program, and we should be pushing that's a short-term program and a medium-term program of building a nuclear fleet, because that's the only low-carbon dispatchable technology we can get in this country. It's that or it's hydro. And unless you're going to move the Grand Inga Dam from the middle of the Congo to the middle of the Free State, which I think is a bit difficult, we've got a problem with that. And we saw that with whatever happened with Kobasa. If your power lines come over the border, you have a degree of politics involved. So yeah, we should be pushing hard on a series of projects, but it shouldn't be one thing. It should be a range of things, but it should be aimed for what the customer actually needs, which is 24/7 power, not what's fashionable.
All right. So the UK announced last week a partnership with South Africa, the US, and a couple of European countries. This Just Transition Energy Partnership, where we're looking to get, in the first phase, $8.5 billion to help us transition from coal. Do you reckon this money should be used then, part of it, for a nuclear build?
Well, I don't know. I think nuclear build will be difficult because Germany is in the team, and Germany is ideologically opposed to nuclear power. There's a series of those examples out there. But also, it's not very much money. I mean, I understand the level of scale we're talking about. I mean, Medupi and Kusile each cost, realistically, say $14 billion each. Right. Round numbers. Maybe it's a bit less than that. So we're talking about, in return for us closing down a very large chunk of our coal fleet, we're talking about somebody lending us, or granting us, as the conditions would be, about half the price of another big coal station. Yeah. So I'm not sure quite where it takes us. I really don't know. And I'm clear the details. I was speaking to the Minister of Environmental Affairs, Ms. Creasy, on the radio TV yesterday. And she was saying basically, no, there's no details for this thing. It's just a number that someone's plucked up in an agreement that they'll find a way to do it. And I think that's the first problem. You're going to find also that it's a requirement to almost certainly the money will get spent in the countries where it came from for them to supply goods to us. I suggest that's what normally happens. Okay. So I don't think there's a need. We can raise money for there's lots of money in the world sloshing around at the moment looking for a home. If you commit to a sensible program, you can do a self-funding program with export credit financing. And you must answer the question of what's gone wrong. I'll give you one example went wrong. IRP 2010 included 9,500 megawatts of nuclear plant, first line machine on stream in 2023. And that was essentially killed off by the anti-lobby who thought it was getting in the way of the renewables. And in fact, it's interesting, Earthlife Africa actually says explicitly on its website, it opposes nuclear power because nuclear power will get in the way of renewables. Not that it's too expensive or it's unsafe or anything else, just it gets in the way of renewables.
Okay, we've
who's funding them is the question.
We've run out of time, but one last question perhaps. The government says it's going to try its best to fix this problem. Andre de Ruyter and his team working terribly hard to try and fix the problem. From where you're standing, 33 years experience at Eskom, you saw this coming as far back as 1998. How much longer do you think we need to brace ourselves for these rolling power outages for? Are we talking months? Are we talking years? What are we looking at?
I think I've seen in my life a number of times when people have come in and have really come in effectively to fix something. And it's always surprising how fast you can fix something if the mind is right and it does right. If you look back to 2016 when we brought in, there was a change of leadership at Eskom, we moved the availability up dramatically over about 6 months. So I believe that in the short-term plan, I want to separate as a short-term plan, a long-term end state and a transition between them. If you can't define those three things, then you haven't got a plan. I believe we could do it reasonably quickly. We'd still constrain the industry because there wouldn't be enough plant to build new plant. But I think we get out of the current crisis in about a year, given the right level of engagement. That would be a short-term response. And then if you don't start doing something like the risk mitigation program and other things, you will find yourself getting back into that in another 5 years later.
Dave Nicholls, the chairperson of NECSA, thank you so much indeed for joining us and giving us some insights with all the experience that you've had in the energy sector. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
All right, that's Dave Nicholls saying that, we've made a couple of miscalculations over decades and that some of what we're seeing today perhaps could have been predicted. And a lot of things need to happen and happen quite quickly to start getting this problem solved.